Glucose homeostasis. Glucose is really important. It's like the gold of the body. So your fasting glucose is about 80 to 90 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, so fasting, meaning like when you wake up in the morning, when you haven't eaten for a long time. Okay, so however long that is. So that should be your fasting blood glucose. Right after a meal, it's around 120 to 140 milligrams per deciliter. It's about normal. So prolonged levels of 120 plus is going to give you hyperglycemia. So hyper meaning a lot, glycemia, sugar or glucose. Your glucose levels after a meal should go back to normal within about 2 hours. So when you eat a big meal, if it's even above 140, it should go back to 120 or below, 110, something like that. Within a couple of hours of eating. So prolonged levels of less than 70 or 70 or less is hypoglycemia. And both of these have problems or issues. So hypoglycemia can send you into, so let's just put hypoglycemia here. So if your blood sugar gets really low, so let's say, less than 50 milligrams per deciliter, that's going to send you into shock. So hypovolemic shock or hypoglycemic shock. It's going to, when your blood sugar is low, obviously irritability problems you've got, you can faint. So fainting, seizures can spark, and you can end up in a coma. Okay. Brain has to have glucose, has to have a store of it or have it going to the brain all the time. Hyperglycemia So hyperglycemia is too much sugar, and that of course is going to head towards diabetes type of thing, but it will cause osmotic issues. When there's too much glucose in the blood and the blood's being filtered, there's a point where the kidneys can't reabsorb it anymore. There's a point where there's not enough transporters to get that glucose back into the blood. So at that point, then it spills over into the urine and is excreted through the urine. Glucose is a large particle, a solute, so water will follow it. And so that causes osmotic issues. And from that glucose excretion, then we get dehydration. So that's why people with diabetes tend to be really thirsty. Okay, they're getting rid of water because their glucose is spilling over into their urine. Too much glucose in the blood vessels, so elevated glucose in vessels, is inflammatory. Okay, so it causes inflammation. And that means inflammatory chemicals freaking out in there. So it's inflammatory, and those chemicals are damaging to endothelium. And that damage, as it's trying to heal, can cause plaques, and that, of course, is cardiovascular disease. So glucose is very important. So how do we get it? How do we get glucose into the cell? Let's see what I've got here. There we go. All right, so let's look at insulin secretion. Where do we get it? Okay, so your blood, you've got capillaries that run through the pancreas. The pancreas doesn't know what your blood glucose is and doesn't really care. It just responds to the glucose that is coming into the beta cells of the pancreas. So if I have my little pancreas cell here, so here's my beta cell, okay, and if we have elevated, elevated glucose here. So if we've got elevated glucose, the beta cells of the pancreas will know that because they have special transporters in their membrane called glut transporters. And they allow for glucose to come into their cells. Inside the cell, just like any other cell, there's going to be mitochondria, and that glucose will basically start going through metabolism. It'll be metabolized. So it goes through, glycolysis and becomes pyruvate, and then pyruvate goes into the mitochondria, and then it goes through all its thing. And what comes out is a bunch of ATP. So it's making all this ATP, and the cell has special channels here that are open for potassium. These are little potassium channels, and they are kind of gated. So they have this little door on them, and it's normally open. So normally potassium is leaving the cell, right? And we know that as potassium's leaving the cell, because of that, we have this. Whoops. Haven't had an action potential yet. Sorry about that. So inside the cell, we have, the inside of the membrane is negative. Okay. Well, as this ATP, once we get a lot of ATP going. So we've got a lot of glucose coming in, a lot of ATP being made. Basically, what happens with this ATP is it comes up here and it shuts this door. Okay, this is a potassium ATP channel. Okay, so it closes that door, and what happens when the door closes? Less potassium is leaving the cell, so that's making the inside of the membrane more positive. Okay, along that membrane is also some other channels, and these are voltage channels for calcium. And when that change, because they're voltage gated, so when the potential gets, increased to that positive number, those voltage gated channels, this voltage gated channel opens, and in comes calcium. Well, inside the beta cell are vesicles. So I'm just going to put a giant vesicle. And inside the vesicle are insulin. And what happens when calcium comes in with vesicles? Well, they make vesicles go through exocytosis. And when that goes through exocytosis, it releases that insulin, and the insulin will go into the blood. Okay, so this only happens when the glucose levels are high, that there's enough glucose coming in to cause that much ATP to be made to cause this process to go. So that's what causes the insulin to get into the blood. Once we have insulin, if we have high glucose and we have insulin in the blood to deal with that glucose, because we're having a high concentration of that, what happens? We have basically two types of cells in the body that deal with insulin. We have insulin dependent cells, and cells that are not dependent on insulin, and that means those are cells in the liver. So insulin dependent cells have a receptor for insulin. And when glucose levels are high, we need insulin there in order to open up that cell for to glucose. Okay, so basically inside the cell, inside the insulin dependent cell, I'm trying to use colors because it just looks better. All right, so inside there are vesicles, and in those vesicles are proteins that form transporters called glut transporters. And when insulin binds here, it will cause the exocytosis, or the release, I shouldn't say exocytosis, it's kind of the release of these glut transporters onto the plasma membrane. And when that happens, then glucose can come in. Okay? In non-dependent cells or liver cells, the glut transporter is always there. So glucose can always get into the liver cell. Okay? But again, glucose levels have to be high, and that would release insulin so that those insulin-dependent cells can actually accept glucose. So that's how we get our glucose into the cell.